Welcome to the latest program in our In the Thick of It series, which brings together journalists reporting from hotspot regions. Today, our panelists will discuss how wars involving the U.S., Iran, and Israel are playing out across the Middle East, raising the risk of wider escalation and regional spillover. All of our panelists are on the ground. And so they'll tell us what life looks like where they are, the broader geopolitical stakes, and what may happen next. They'll talk for about half an hour and then take questions. Please put all your questions in the chat at any time. So now I will introduce today's moderator, Mohamad Bazzi. He's director of the Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies at New York University and an associate professor of journalism. So he's here in New York. From 2009 to 2013, he served as adjunct senior fellow for the Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Before joining the NYU faculty, Mohamad was the Middle East bureau chief at Newsday from 2003 to 2008, where he established bureaus in Baghdad and Beirut. He was the lead writer on the Iraq War and its aftermath. Mohamad has also cooperated with the OPC to host programs for students at NYU. Thank you, Mohamad, for jumping in on very short notice. We are very grateful. Now I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to the OPC for asking me, and thank you for organizing this panel. I'm going to introduce our speakers, some just brief bios to contextualize everyone and where they are, and then we'll get into our discussion. So Nabih Bulos is the Middle East bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. Since 2012, he has covered the aftermath of the Arab Spring revolutions, as well as the resurgence of ISIS and the campaign to defeat it throughout the Middle East. His work has taken him to Syria, Iraq, Libya, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Yemen, as well as the migrant trail through the Balkans and Northern Europe. A Fulbright scholar, Bulos is also a concert violinist. Heidi Pett is the
Syria. Old bio. I really have to update it.
Sorry. Okay. Well,
I really have to update the bio. Sorry, pardon me. I really have to update this bio. I forgot to do so.
Okay, that's okay. We can update it in the course of the discussion too. Okay, Heidi Pett is the Syria correspondent for Al Jazeera English. She's based in Damascus. She's been based in Damascus since shortly after the fall of the Assad regime. She's been based in Lebanon for the most part over the last 2 months since the start of the Iran war. She specializes in international news and investigations, and especially in narrative podcasts, TV news, and radio documentaries. And her work has appeared in outlets including The Economist, the BBC, Channel 4 News, Politico, and ABC. So she's been in Beirut, but today she's joining us from Damascus. She's been in Beirut and traveling throughout Lebanon, and we'll talk about that. Stephen Kalin is a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal based in the Middle East, where he's lived since 2009. He moved to Riyadh in 2017 to cover the rise of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the social, economic, and political shifts that have been underway in the kingdom. He's reported on every major development in contemporary Saudi Arabia and its Gulf neighbors. Stephen previously worked for Reuters for 7 years, and he's also been reporting from Ukraine after the Russian invasion in 2022. He's done that for the Journal. And finally, Daniel Estrin is NPR's international correspondent based in Jerusalem. Since joining NPR in 2017, he has reported from Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the UAE. He and his team were awarded an Edward R. Murrow Award for a 2019 report challenging the U.S. military's account about its raid against the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Before joining NPR, Daniel worked for the AP for 7 years. Okay, thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with with Stephen, who is recently reporting out of Kuwait, and he's been covering the fallout of the U.S.-Israel-Iran war. He's been covering the fallout, especially on Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, other Gulf states that have been in the crosshairs of this war. So in that on the ground reporting that he's been doing from Kuwait, from Saudi, and elsewhere, um, he's also draws on his experience having covered Iraq for a long time. And I think one of the themes that you've been writing about, Stephen, is the role of the Iraqi militias in this war. One of the things that was very interesting out of your piece is you noted out of this piece from Kuwait that possibly half of the drone strikes in Saudi Arabia had actually originated uh, out of the Shia militias in Iraq. So can you tell us a bit about the role of Iraq, which is, I think, something we haven't seen a lot of coverage on in the US, and partly this is a complicated war. It's a multi-front war involving Iran, Israel, the US. Lebanon has been a huge part of this war, but that role of the Iraqi militias, Iran's allies in Iraq, and how they've targeted the GCC states. So let's start with that, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Mohamad. I think it is it's an important part of this conflict that I think hasn't gotten sort of due attention, partly because there, as you said, there is so much else going on. I mean, there's first, the bombing in Iran, the retaliation across the Gulf states, as well as Jordan and Israel. And obviously the debacle through the Strait of Hormuz. There's so many aspects of this that we're all trying to cover. I think so Iraq unfortunately gets sort of short shrift in the last couple of months. Something that caught our attention early on. One of my colleagues wrote, I think it was the beginning of March, about a series of U.S. Of what. Pretty confident, U.S. raids in Iraq and strikes against Iraqi militia leaders in places like Jarfa, just outside of Baghdad, that again went sort of under the radar because there was so much else going on at the time. And then when I went to Saudi about sort of the middle of March, end of March. It kind of struck me at how many people there were talking about the Iraqis, but that really I hadn't heard much about it until I got there. That a lot of the attacks had been coming from the north of Saudi, not just the east. And then I actually spent last week in Kuwait, and obviously they are sort of pre-programmed to have a paranoia about the Iraqis, and in this case, that it's well founded. They also think that perhaps half of the drone attacks that have come against them have come from Iraqi militias, and they're particularly concerned about that. Obviously, there's a historical concern there, given the Saddam's invasion 35 years ago. But there's also the sense that this Iraqi government has even less control over the militias than previous ones did. There's a power vacuum in Baghdad. They're just sort of moving forward on the process of selecting a prime minister after elections last year. And there's also a sense that the militias, there's less control over the militias. Obviously, command and control of the IRGC is something of a question that we're involved in trying to understand a little bit better after sort of the decapitation of the regime in Tehran, and in terms of not just political, but also a lot of the top military leaders, both last summer and then the beginning of this conflict. A lot of questions about whether, how autonomously some of these units are operating. I think in Iraq that is exacerbated. There's a sense that the Iranians don't really have command and control over a lot of these groups. That may also be partly a convenient sort of plausible deniability that these groups attack in the name of a sort of a fictitious name, just to be able to have plausible deniability. But those essentially they're continued to send attacks across the borders even after the ceasefire went into effect and after the Iranians began respecting it after the first 24 to 36 hours last month. So the Kuwaitis also interestingly have a concern about that their physical border, which I didn't pick up when I was in Saudi. They're more concerned about these aerial attacks. The Kuwaitis have I think it's a 160-mile border with Kuwait. With Iraq, I went up to the border last week. It is pretty flat and open and very sort of hard to defend. You'd have to imagine that even with a lot of the American troops having left some of their bases after the war began, there's still quite a lot of reconnaissance of that border, and that any infiltration would be detected. But that's certainly a worry that I picked up while I was in Kuwait.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. We'll come back to some more questions about the situation in GCC. Sort of moving outward from Iran, I want to ask Nabih and Heidi about Lebanon, which is sort of short of Iran, has suffered the most destruction of this war, and actually per capita, the death toll in Lebanon is significantly higher than the death toll in Iran. So I want to ask you both about what you've been reporting. You both reported from southern Lebanon, and you've both reported from Beirut extensively. You both reported on the attacks on April 8th, which is the morning after the first iteration of the ceasefire went into effect. Those 100 Israeli airstrikes within 10 minutes across Beirut, across the Bekaa, across southern Lebanon, that really terrified the people of Lebanon. It spread panic, it spread terror throughout Lebanon. So we can tell us a bit about that and the aftermath of those attacks, and also this situation in the south right now where the Israeli military is bulldozing and dynamiting wholesale towns. There are about 55 towns that are being occupied by Israeli forces right now. So anything you can shed light on these questions? Maybe let's start with Heidi and then go to Nabih. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, in terms of April 8th, you're right. It was just a completely terrifying day for most people across Lebanon. I was actually, at that point, I was working the night shift, right? And so I was awake at sort of 2 o'clock in the morning local time when the announcement was made about the Iran-Israel-US ceasefire. And then there was a sort of, there was a bit of confusion in Lebanon. Does this apply to us? And then there was a tweet actually by the Pakistani Prime Minister, which came about an hour afterwards, so sort of 3 o'clock in the morning local time, which said, yes, this ceasefire applies to Lebanon. And at that point, people actually started going home, right? Like the highways south started getting busy before dawn that day. And it was at 6 a.m. local time that then you had this announcement from the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, saying, no, ceasefire doesn't apply. And so there was this sort of confusion. There were people who still continued going south, going back into Dahia, wanting to go home, check on their houses, things like that. I went to sleep at that point and then woke up at when these strikes happened, right, at 2 p.m. local time. And it just like the whole city shook. And so heading out and speaking to people about that, I remember having a conversation with one person who said, like, we couldn't understand why it took so long for the emergency services to arrive, because it was, it's a personal tragedy for every person when their apartment gets blown up, when somebody in their family is killed by an airstrike. And in that initial moment, there wasn't really any understanding of the scale of what had happened, right? Each person thought it was just their apartment building that had been destroyed. And as it turns out, no, it's, more than 10 in Beirut, more than 100 across the country. And so it was just, I think, as a journalist, but also as a person in Lebanon, it took a while to even really, we're in all these WhatsApp groups with other journalists and even our small one for the newsroom. And someone said, oh, there was a strike in, I think it was in downtown. And then someone else jumped in and said, no, it wasn't in downtown, it was here. And even amongst ourselves, it was a moment of, oh no, hang on, it's everywhere. They hit the entire country at once, which was just the scale of that, it was more than, they're still counting the toll from that day. They're still trying to do DNA testing and identify actually how many people died, but it was more than 350 people killed. And, Beirut was just, the whole city smelled like explosives. It was, the impact was enormous. And it was such a frightening, terrifying, and confusing and disappointing day for many people in Lebanon who had really hoped that that regional ceasefire was going to apply. And then the Israeli military just made it so incredibly clear that it didn't. And there's still ongoing debate and questions within Lebanon, right, about whether a ceasefire is stronger if it's applied within that regional framework, if it's tied to whatever is happening in Iran, or you have the position of the Lebanese government, which says, no, this is an issue of sovereignty. Nobody else is negotiating on our behalf. We are going to negotiate and apply a separate ceasefire, which is what is ostensibly happening at the moment. But anytime you're anywhere in South Lebanon, it's very, very clear that while, yes, there's a ceasefire in Beirut, which hasn't been struck since the 16th of April, the strikes in South Lebanon are constant. The windows are shaking. You hear the warplanes overhead. There's the airstrikes, there's the demolitions, there's artillery shelling, there's white phosphorus. It's constant all day, every day. And that's in the zone that the Israelis are ostensibly trying to occupy or to control, to say nothing of the ways that they're extending control over the population in South Lebanon north of that, trying to depopulate. And Nabih actually had a really good piece out that came out today about the ways that they're using control of the telecommunications network to identify targets and to place these terrifying phone calls, which is something I've actually been working on as well. So I saw your piece come out today, Nabih, and I was like, damn. He beat me to it again. But it's an incredible piece of journalism about the way that Israel selects and then identifies and then places calls to targets. And maybe you can talk a bit more about it. You're on mute.
You're muted, Nabih.
Sorry, pardon me. Thank you, Heidi. I apologize. I'm not very good at Zoom. Pardon me. Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is that, Lebanon has been turned essentially into a panopticon, is really what it amounts to, in terms of just the sheer amount of surveillance. Now, none of these pieces of surveillance are revolutionary on their own. I mean, Israel has long had access to, for example, the phone database, the DMV database, so that license plates, I mean, all license plates are known in Lebanon anyway. I mean, back in the day, maybe about 10 years ago, you could actually get on WhatsApp and you could send a license plate number, and you would get back the information, through some bot before that was finally canceled. All that is to say that this information is available, right? And certainly for the Israelis. And along that, you have this notion that the Israelis have actually hacked into Tatra, which is the emergency network here that's used by services, like civil defense and others. And all that is basically now being filtered through, I suppose, this AI that creates patterns, right? Back in the day, you would have this sort of metadata analysis of various things, of various inputs, and through that you could basically create a target list. Now all that is being done by AI using these sort of this sort of pattern recognition, and that's just one element of what we're talking about here. Because the fact of the matter is, if you look at what's been happening in Lebanon, really over the last, since April 8th and since April 16th, I should say, and then also before that, right, we are in a situation where now we're in this sort of halfway war or a twilight war, where, as Heidi said, in Beirut and areas north of Beirut, it's fine. People are going out. I mean, yes, it's subdued socially, right? But the much vaunted Lebanese resilience, right, is on display. And at the same time, in the south, it is an absolute war. The main difference this time is that Hezbollah is actually fighting, right? As opposed to the last 15 months before the conflagration with Iran began on February 28th. This time Hezbollah has actually decided to respond even during the ceasefire, whereas that was not happening for 15 months, right? Since the last ceasefire between, since the last, I guess ceasefire was, I think, 24th of November, I believe, or something around that time of 2024. So, the point here is that right now what we're seeing is total war in one part of the country. And again, as you said, Mohamad, we are talking about a huge number of casualties casualties here. And at the same time, people are having to watch their villages. What we're seeing in Lebanon, in South Lebanon, I should say, is the same as what we saw in Gaza. This idea that you can basically just go in, raise the town or village, right, and create the equivalent of Vietnam era's Phoenix program to destroy anyone who is linked to Hezbollah, whether it is a fighter, a civil defense fighter, or, a civil defense member, a banker, or really anyone else who is part of Hezbollah's environment. And that really is the key point that we're seeing here. Now, at the same time, again, as Heidi said, the Lebanese government, and indeed I think the Lebanese themselves, are divided over how to deal with this. Some will tell you that they, of course, are weary of war and want to have peace, but at the same time, many do worry about what's going to happen when it comes to actually, this notion of normalization, or this idea of Israel wanting to create some sort of a buffer zone or a security zone, or whatever euphemism you want to use for it. It is essentially a repeat of what was done in the 80s up to the 2000s, it seems. And that is the fear right now, or one of the many fears, I should say, right now.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up on this, Nabih. Your story, I'm very glad Heidi mentioned your exceptional story about the use of AI. And I think one of the very impressive parts of it was the character, your central character. And there were many striking things about that the central character who was killed and got this incredibly dystopian phone call, sort of right before, about 10 minutes before he was killed. He was asked if he wanted to die with his relatives or be killed on his own, and he said on his own, and basically fled. It's a incredibly dramatic reporting. One of the things that struck me about that story, Nabih, and I think both of you touched on this, is that this, he was someone, you described him as a former fighter, a retired fighter. He was in his 60s, and he was in, from by all accounts, I think that you could trace, was that he was now in the civilian wing, let's say, sort of in the civilian infrastructure of Hezbollah, which is extensive. And one of the things that struck me about that was just this, because it's another echo of the Gaza model of targeting anyone who is remotely connected to Hamas and to the government arms of Hamas, the civilian wings of Hamas in Gaza, and then extending that out to Lebanon. And the Israelis have done this before in 2006 and previous conflicts in Lebanon as well. But it reminded me of the pager attacks in September 2024, where here was these booby trap pagers that Israel had distributed to Hezbollah members. Just through this, they had done it through this scheme of getting it into the hands of Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah distributed it to their members. And Hezbollah made clear, I think, on the first day of the attacks, that they had actually distributed pagers not just to fighters, but they had distributed to their civilian workers. So there were medics, there were people who worked in supermarkets, there were people who worked in their banking system, there were people who worked in these civilian roles. And that's one of the ways I would argue certainly Israel committed a war crime that day, fairly clearly, of you're not supposed to use booby traps in war. But this blurring of the line that we saw it in Gaza first, and then we've seen in Lebanon with these institutions. So with these militant movements that essentially also have civilian institutions attached to them, and so you have some thoughts on how, sort of the complexity of covering that and the complexity of conveying this, because I think a lot of U.S. audiences don't have the sense that Hezbollah actually runs this extensive civilian infrastructure. Either one of it. Nabih, if you want to start with.
I must say, I think the fact of the matter is, I think the fact of the matter is that it is not, all that complicated. I mean, the rules of war mean that combatants are a fair target, right? Whereas the 1 billion roles would not be perhaps acceptable as targets. I mean, again, imagine if, if an Iranian missile targeted, a bunch of, I guess, U.S. Army administrators, would that be considered okay? Probably not, right? If they were like in a hotel or what have you, right? As we have seen, a fair amount of complaints from the U.S. military about such attacks. At the same time, it's worth noting that Hezbollah, like Hamas, has a strong social component. This wasn't just a matter of a fighting group, right? This is a group that, again, has a functioning banking system that serves a lot of poor people in Lebanon, that has a functioning educational system, that has, that has many, many social programs that have made it an essential part of the social fabric of South Lebanon, and indeed many other parts of Lebanon as well. Right? To pretend that this is a purely military situation is, I think, wrong. Now, of course, at the same time, we have seen this behavior before, right? Not just in Gaza, but this was the idea that was sort of the organizing theory behind things like the Phoenix program, where you go in, into a village in Vietnam, and you kill everyone, you raise everything, right? And the idea there is that the fighters, will no longer have an environment to operate in. I can understand that at some level, but we should be in no doubt that this is a war crime. I think the interesting thing here is that with Ahmed Turmus, who was the character that was mentioned in the story, he served as a liaison, a rabit in Arabic is the word. And these liaisons, it should be noted that Hezbollah is involved in the municipalities of each of these southern villages, or I should say most of them. And so when it comes to the matter of electricity provision, water provision, roads, etc., just basic infrastructure, of course Hezbollah is going to be involved because these mayors are, they're part of the party in some fashion. So all this is important to note.
Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, I think it's. Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think it's unless you've been and worked in Lebanon, it's hard to understand the nature of how much Hezbollah really is a state within a state, right? Like there are, Hezbollah schools, Hezbollah banking institutions. You go to any, as Nabih mentioned, you go to any council in the south and there is a tie to Hezbollah. They have their own health service. They have their own paramedics who have been targeted relentlessly over the last 2 months and over the last, 2 years, really. But I think unless you have an understanding that, it's not just a militant armed group. They have MPs in the parliament. There's a whole social structure. And so the idea that you can and should target anybody who is in any way affiliated with them, including journalists, right? They've targeted journalists who work for channels that are affiliated with Hezbollah. And there have been various excuses made for that. Sometimes there's no excuse made. Sometimes it's merely they're Hezbollah. Sometimes there is an excuse to say that one of the senior broadcasters is actually a member of the Radwan force, and here is a photoshopped image that we have produced to prove that. But a lot of the time there is no justification even to say that these people are fighters. It's their affiliation with Hezbollah, whether civilian or military, is enough.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Daniel, who is joining us from Tel Aviv. And if you can, Daniel, if you can give us a sense of what life has been like in Israel during these last 2 months of war. It's with the ceasefire. I think it's past the phase of people being spending most of their time in shelters, and also if you can talk a bit about the shift in Israeli public opinion about the Iran war, where it was there was very strong support in Israel for launching this war. So maybe some of the shifts in opinion on the war, and I think connected to that is I think we've seen some polling and showing that Israelis think that they've lost all the wars in the region, despite the tremendous destruction that's been caused. So let's start with that, and we can get to some of the other issues as well.
Sure. In a word, it was surreal here for more than 40 days. Because Israeli public life continued kind of normally. I was sitting at a Thai restaurant, and then you get an alert on your phone, and you look around you, and everyone is, almost, I don't want to use the word zombies, but it really almost looked like people walking in unison toward shelters. And so I left my food on the table and went down to the nearest shelter and crammed in there with 30, 40 other Israelis. And you would hear very loud booms of missiles being intercepted, or oftentimes missiles evading Israel's anti-missile systems and falling, causing damage and sometimes killing people. And then you'd wait a little bit and go back out to your food. So that was happening multiple times a day. People were waking up in the middle of the night multiple times. And I've been reporting here for nearly 2 decades. And I have never understood the extent to which this country, Israel, is built upon shelters, basement shelters. I mean, I found myself in the bowels of the Church of Scientology in Jaffa, the traditionally Palestinian city, in the basement next to the purification room, which is also doubles as the bomb shelter. I mean, just totally surreal things that you experience as a person, not just as a journalist covering this war, but as a person. I mean, Israelis, the schools were canceled, so people had kids at home and they were working, and so many Israelis were also enlisted in the military reserves. And so there's a real entanglement whenever there's a war here. And Palestinians in the West Bank were killed by Iranian missile fire, where there are no shelters. So you see how society, you really see the stratification of society in a war like this. In terms of public opinion in Israel, it was really fascinating to see. At the beginning of the war, among Jewish Israelis, polls showed something like over 90% support for the war. The initial knockout, targeting and killing the Iranian supreme leader after tracking him through traffic cameras, which the Financial Times initially reported, and I also confirmed with an Israeli official. So there was a real sense of wow, talking, like Nabih, and we were talking about some of the high tech strategies that Israel employs in its deadly attacks. That Israeli officials were boasting about that, and I think Israelis felt like, wow, this actually the goal of regime change. Um, Maybe that's possible. We were hearing that. And support among Israelis for the Iran war in the weeks that followed slipped to somewhere around 70-ish% among Jewish Israelis. So still very high, but that is a significant slip. And I think, you saw some interesting things. In the middle of the war, Israel enacted this campaign of hanging up American flags along the highway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv almost overnight. And just, miles and miles and miles and miles and miles of driving past Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, going to Jerusalem and seeing these American flags. And the idea was to boost morale, to give Israelis a sense of, okay, you're not alone. Yes, you're um, running into shelters day and night. And yeah, we're telling you that the regime is, steps away from being dismantled and toppled, and yet that's not happening. And so we're going to make you feel that America, at least America, is with us. And I think mirroring what happened along the Gaza war, where you saw people in the first weeks of the war, there were a trickle of, I would say, you know, far left Israeli protesters protesting the war, and police went after them. And gradually, you saw these protests that swelled every weekend to hundreds of thousands of people, even protesting the continuation of the war and saying that Israel needs to prioritize striking a deal with Hamas for hostages. And so I think in parallel, you saw a kind of a mini um, trend here in Israel with people protesting the war in Iran. It was by a lot smaller scale, and it did start with the hardcore um, left-wing activists, but it did grow into slightly more mainstream. And so it was fascinating to see that kind of disillusionment, even among um, mainstream commentators in Israeli media.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to ask you kind of two interrelated follow-ups. One about some of the reporting you've done about the surge in settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank as the Iran war has unfolded, and also on NPR's continued reporting out of Gaza. You're one of the few U.S. And Western outlets that still has a full-time journalist working for you in Gaza, and sort of some of the and tell us a bit about that process, and also some of what's emerging, because we've also seen, we've seen as we started this conversation, there's so many things going on in so many different places that it's difficult to keep up journalistically and headline wise. But also sometimes, you have states that use this as an excuse to ramp up violence, attacks. And we've seen some renewal of Israeli attacks in Gaza. We've seen some reporting about the yellow line, the so-called yellow line expanding. So Israel using this time to expand its hold on territory in Gaza. So whatever you can tell us about that.
Yeah, the changes in the West Bank in the last 3 years since October 7th are astonishing. And since the Iran war, um, even more so, I think, in different ways. Human rights groups tracked Israeli settler attacks in more than 100 Palestinian villages just in the first 3 or 4 weeks of the Iran war, which lasted around 40 days. So throughout that time, there was a major ramp up in Israeli settler attacks. I was out in the West Bank with my colleagues and met a man who was a strawberry farmer, and suddenly essentially a militia of settlers descended upon his village, attacked, and one of them opened fire and killed his young son, and then another one stabbed him, saying, "Die, die, die." And we met him in his home. He was in using crutches. He was recuperating from his wounds, and he speaks fluent Hebrew because he spent years working inside Israel until October 7th, and Israel shut off all Palestinian laborers' access to their jobs. And I mean, all of us, all our journalists here on this panel have interviewed people during the worst days of their life in grief, crying. Seeing him cry over the death of his son for just a senseless act of hateful violence, and then him switching into Hebrew, speaking with an Israeli colleague, saying, "Where is the Israeli TV and why aren't they talking about this?" And what you did see during the Iran war and the surge of Israeli settler violence was that under pressure from the Trump administration, Netanyahu spoke out and some other Israeli senior leaders spoke out, denouncing in words this trend. Even the pro-settler and the settler minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who is really the mastermind of so much of the changes that's happening in the West Bank, he wrote an opinion column in a kind of a pro-settler newspaper. But no new policies. Israel continues to equip settlers with military-issued rifles. It still provides army protection for settlers while they are enacting new land grabs. And I think the most fascinating part of my reporting in the West Bank was that all these words and this denunciation is not trickling down to the settlers themselves. So we stopped at a hummus restaurant in the middle of the West Bank, run by Israeli settlers, and I spoke with some, and one conversation really sticks with me. An American-born settler who said, "Okay, so you met a Palestinian who says his son was killed. Did you see it? He claims he was attacked. Did you see that?" So he just didn't even believe that this is a widespread phenomenon. And he said, this is not a mass thing because you're not seeing mass arrests. And it's true, you're not seeing mass arrests, and that's by design. And so there's this surge of violence is backed up by this far right Israeli government. And I think it's very telling that the mainstream, not the hardcore radical hundreds of settlers, but the mainstream settler population don't even register this as a actual phenomenon. And then you also asked, I'll just speak briefly about Gaza, Mohamad. So Anas Baba is our reporter in Gaza. He's been there since before October 7th, reporting for us for NPR, and living the same conditions that of the people he's reporting on. He recently, I'll just give you one example of the most recent story he reported, and actually It's going to be broadcast tonight on All Things Considered on NPR. He spent 3 days with a crew from Gaza Civil Defense recovering bodies of Palestinians, all extended family members of one family, the Abu Nasser family. This was one of the deadliest strikes in the entire Gaza war. That's according to an investigation that we did, and along with air wars, documenting 132 members of this family killed in an instant. And this is just an example of the power of having a journalist on the ground in a place like Gaza, which is still blocked off for independent media access for us getting into Gaza more than 2 years now in an unprecedented manner. But Anas was there and just documenting, the fact that there is one excavator machine in Gaza, one functioning digger machine for the kind of work of recovering what is believed to be thousands of bodies still under rubble. Right? We're more than 6 months into the alleged or the ceasefire, which is not a ceasefire. And this family of 132 members killed in an instant. This was a strike in October of 2024. So think about it, nearly a year and a half later. What remains, and I'm sorry for the graphic image, are skeletons inside clothing, found in the last moments of their life, under, concrete slabs. And so I think it's just important to remember and to report the gruesome reality and those details. The reality that thousands of bodies are still not buried, have not been given a final resting place, and Israel does not permit the entry of more machinery, and that's part of the bigger policy, which is that Israel does not allow any major rehabilitation, any major reconstruction, so long as Hamas is not disarmed.
Yeah. Thank you. It's extremely powerful reporting. I'm going to go back to Stephen for a moment, and I want to ask you, Stephen, about the GCC and the sense in the GCC and what you've picked up from just people, policymakers across society about the reverberations of this war. So we've seen the economic impact fairly clearly, the impact on the oil industry and oil prices and their economies. But there's also this aspect of the questions that are being asked in the GCC about the future relationship with the US, the future of the bases, the military bases that we've also now seen reporting that these military bases have, some of which have sustained far greater damage than we had realized, thanks to CNN's reporting, and NBC and others have done pieces of this reporting. So the future of the relationship with the US, maintaining these bases that the Gulf states invested so much money in and thought that this is the ticket to their protection. So anything you've gathered on that from your reporting, and also and sort of the economic consequences of the war and social ones in the GCC. And I think it's also a chance for you to talk about the restrictions that we've seen in various GCC countries.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good questions. It does feel, in a sense, like there's a reckoning delayed in the GCC. There's a lot of questions around this, the U.S. security relationship, which has been fraying for years now, if not several decades. The U.S. has been seen, I think the height of Gulf confidence in the U.S. was the Iraq invasion and the response to the Iraq invasion in 1990, when the Americans sent hundreds of thousands of troops into Saudi Arabia to restore Kuwait. And ever since then, really, I think the Gulf states have been wanting that level of sort of a bear hug from Washington. And they've felt sort of one administration after another that they were being disappointed. I think it started with Obama, with the original Iran deal that they felt was negotiated behind their backs, and not taking into consideration all of their concerns, which were not just the nuclear program, but also Iran's missile program, its support for militias across the region, its intervention in their domestic affairs. So I think it started there, and for Saudi Arabia, I think the lack of an immediate response to the Abqaiq attacks, the attacks in their oil fields back in 2000, that was 19, was it? 18, 19? Everything's squishing together now. The sort of lack of an immediate response, I think, raised more questions about how much can we rely on the U.S. You saw diversification. I think that was led by the UAE, but also we've seen it Saudi Arabia looking at alternative partners, not necessarily security partners, but looking to diversify, recognizing that there is no replacement for the US for these countries. In some ways, I think they feel a little bit stuck because they're with the US. They've bought billions of dollars of high-tech equipment. And it's not easy to pivot to another security provider if there were one available. But what we have seen, I think the initial reactions, which I think we'll see more of in the months and years to come, is you've seen the UAE get a lot closer to Israel, deepen that relationship, which began in 2020. I mean, the official relationship began in 2020 with the Abraham Accords. It goes back quite some time, sort of secret security dealings. That's deepened quite a bit. You've also seen the UAE and other countries partner with, for example, the Ukrainians on anti-drone capabilities. I think the French, the Italians have been seen as really reliable partners swooping in to help support these countries' defenses. The Pakistanis sent in a number of jets to Saudi Arabia after the ceasefire began. So a diversification of those relationships. It does seem, from everything that we can tell, and that reporting you mentioned, that U.S. bases were really hammered across the region in ways that took I think most people by surprise. There's a question of, we don't really know how bad it is. We've gotten little snapshots into damage. How much is it going to cost to rebuild? Is it worth rebuilding? Is it worth building in a different way, or building the bases in different places? I think those are questions that will have to be borne out with time. I think there is a popular kind of response in many of these countries to the relationship, which is sort of as the way you framed it, as why were we relying on these guys? They were sort of, they didn't protect us in our time of need. I think there's also among a lot of the security officials an awareness that it wasn't perfect, but that the bases being hit. The bases are the tip of the iceberg in terms of the security relationship. The bases are part of a relationship that give these countries access to high-tech weaponry, which served them generally pretty well. The damage is worse than it's really ever been in these tit for tats going back the last few years, but nowhere nearly as bad as it could have been had these sort of air defenses not been in place. So I think there's a bit of sort of calibrating between that popular reaction and the official sort of security establishment. And there's also, I think, some questioning around, the Gulf is not a monolith, and different countries are affected differently. Kuwait and Qatar, for example, are completely cut off from exporting fuel, oil and gas, which is their their lifeline. Bahrain is as well, but Bahrain will be supported by big brothers in the region. Qatar and Kuwait will be able to, if they need to, burn through a lot of their savings, their investment fund, liquidate some of their investment fund. It's not ideal, but they're not going to go broke. Saudi and the UAE at the moment are continuing to export a decent amount through these alternative pipelines at a much higher price. So they're actually doing okay in that regard. But I think there is a bigger question about the economic viability of these models that are based on openness, trade, foreign investment, tourism, when you're in a region that your geography sort of locks you in to a problematic dynamic with Iran and Iran's allies. And so that's why, and to go back to sort of this reporting from my newspaper and others around whether the Gulf countries wanted, whether Saudi and the UAE were pushing for war, what their position is. I think there was largely a sense before the war started that these countries would rather avoid direct conflict because of the dire economic consequences. But that since the war has begun, they do not want to be left with an Iran that is still capable of threatening them, that's more belligerent, that's aggrieved even more than it was before, that has proven its ability to close the straits and its ability to and sort of broken the red line of striking U.S. bases, oil infrastructure, economic infrastructure across the Gulf. So now they're sort of in a place where they wish the war hadn't started, but it has, and they're concerned about it ending before the threat is removed.
Thanks. Thank you, Stephen. I see one question in the chat, so I'm going to ask it. It's a question that everyone can jump in and answer this. And actually, so this is a question from William, and I'll make a slight adjustment, or I'll add something to it as well, because I think Heidi can give us some perspective about Syria on this. So this is William's question. Can any semblance of stability be recreated through diplomacy, or have the U.S.-Israeli wars in Iran and Lebanon created long-term volatility that lasts for years? I think all of you can weigh in on this, but this question also made me think a little bit about, in terms of long-term volatility, of the spillover. We've talked about Iraq, we've talked about Iran, we've talked about Lebanon, we've talked about Israel here. We haven't talked very much about Syria, where there has been some spillover, although the worst case scenarios maybe weren't right. We're seeing that early some early speculation in March that Syria might get involved in the war. Syrian forces might confront Hezbollah. So I'll start with you, Heidi, on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting, right? I was actually in Lebanon just before the war started, and speaking to people in Lebanon, including my colleagues who are asking, like, what is going on? Is Syria going to invade? And I almost wanted to say, like, oh, baby, we don't think about you at all. Like, nobody in Damascus was talking about it at this point, but it was very much a Lebanese preoccupation, which obviously there is a deep history there of Syrian invasion and occupation of Lebanon, so it doesn't come from nowhere. But the situation in Syria would have been very, very different if this had broken out before December of 2024, right? When we had the Assad regime in power here, where there was a strong presence of Iranian militias across the country, particularly in eastern Syria. You had Hezbollah presence and history here in this country. It would have played out very, very differently here if the Assad regime was still in power. And I remember having a conversation with my housemate the day that the war started, when Israel and the US launched those strikes on Iran. And my bosses immediately said, go to Lebanon, right? Like it's going to start there. It hadn't yet. It took a sort of 36 hours. And my housemate was saying, should I be worried? Like, why are they sending you away? Is something terrible going to happen here? And I said, oh no, they're sending me away because nothing terrible is going to happen here. Like something terrible is going to happen next door. But Syria has escaped, yeah, largely unharmed. There were a few strikes on US bases, most of them actually after the US had emptied them. I don't know if anybody gave the Iranian militias in Iraq a heads up that the US was actually gone by the point that they struck some of those bases. And it's remained largely untouched. And actually, there has long been discussion about now that Syria is stabilizing, whether it becomes a land route from, Saudi through to Turkey, whether it becomes a route for energy, but also, infrastructure in terms of like fiber optic cables and internet and all that kind of stuff. And we are starting to see the sort of lo-fi beginning of that, right? Like there has not been enough time or money to rebuild pipelines, to lay fiber optic cable, or to do any of those kind of big grand ideas that are being talked about, but they're trucking oil across Syria right now. Countries are exporting oil. They're crossing it from Iraq all the way across Syria and to Syrian ports on the Mediterranean, which are now starting to export oil from the region. And it's not enough scale to really be worthwhile for anyone right now, but it's definitely a beginning. And I think that's something that a lot of people here in Syria are hoping will become more possible and that can be done at scale. But yeah, the atmosphere here, when the war broke out, talking to people was like, oh, thank God for once this has nothing to do with us.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this very open-ended question, long-term volatility? Nabih.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I have a thesis actually about all this, which is that U.S. diplomacy in the region, because that really is what we're talking about when we talk about diplomacy in the region, right? The issue is that I would argue that really over the last few decades, we have seen a sort of organizing principle of U.S. diplomacy where essentially people of the Middle East, who are not Israeli, are essentially livestock. So that basically, people in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, Iraq, etc., these places, the people there, the residents there are essentially like cows and sheep, right? They don't have rights per se. They have economic comfort, right? You provide them with some economic comfort so they can produce for you. But this notion of rights and democracy and right to sort of determine one's fate, these are not really meant for those peoples, right? They are exclusively presented to Israelis. And really that thesis I think holds if you look at the way that the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration talk about legitimate grievances of these peoples, right? This notion that, for example, that Lebanon or the Lebanese will just simply sort of wave a wand and want to have peace with Israel, just ignoring the decades of grievances, right, against them. This really, this is the sort of ethos that you find from most U.S. diplomats, and the fact is, it will not work. Right? There are legitimate problems and grievances that need to be dealt with. And the fact is that I haven't seen yet a single US diplomat address those grievances, talk about them in a realistic fashion. We hear these grand plans about economic zones between Lebanon and Israel, right? Or this idea that, we're going to have, vetted journalists visit each other. Yay, right? But the fact of the matter is that there are certain things that need to be dealt with, right? There are certain rights, right? And certain issues that have never been resolved properly. And whereas now, for example, Syria has actually managed to, I suppose, be relatively unscathed by all of this, the fact of the matter is that we are seeing volatility there happen as well, because Israel has occupied a territory larger than Gaza, right? A Syrian territory that's larger than Gaza. And I should add that it also has now control of about 40% of Syria's southern water infrastructure, which in turn means that it has a knife to Jordan, because Jordan relies on that water to be able to fulfill its needs. It's worth noting that Jordan is, I think, the second most water poor country in the world. All this is to say that I don't think American diplomacy, as we have seen it, right, will actually be able to enact any kind of stability, and that volatility will remain to be the case, especially because we've seen no restraining force on Israel. We are now talking about an imperial Israel in the Middle East that will talk about the notion of a Greater Israel project quite openly and quite happily. And with that in mind, of course, there will be no stability. How can there be with that situation? It is impossible.
Yeah, because eventually we'll need a buffer zone for the buffer zone.
Yes, that's where we're headed. Nabih, if we can wrap up with this thought, unless also you have questions for each other. Well, I think one, and I agree with your analysis on this. I think one of those rights, one of the issues, one of the core issues that has to be resolved is Palestine, right, and the rights of Palestinians. And this is the issue that the U.S. has avoided now for decades. It's the issue that successive Israeli governments have avoided. Um, and that's so we constantly we've had U.S. policy built around the idea that the question of Palestinians, what to do with the people of Palestine, what to do gets deferred endlessly, and for a while the Trump administration, when it began to conceive the Abraham Accords, basically tried to negotiate around the Palestinians, right? You sort of negotiate around that question and make it something to be contained. Um, and Biden largely kept that. Let's remember how the Biden administration really tried to. One of their main goals was to expand the Abraham Accords to Saudi Arabia, the elusive Saudi-Israel deal that they spent years on. So, if I can ask you all, and I think Stephen might have had to leave us at this point, but if I can ask you all. For any thoughts on that, on where, and especially, and if you don't want to delve into the political analysis of it, but the coverage, are there ways to keep this issue, this core question in the coverage? Daniel, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think something we should keep in mind is the changing public opinion in the US, which is not a surprise to any one of us. But the Pew poll recently put it really starkly. 60% of US adults now have an unfavorable view of Israel. And in both political parties, um, the majority of people under the age of 50, so I guess you could call that young people plus, now consider Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu unfavorably, which means that these are the future Congress people, these are the future senators, these are the future decision makers of the U.S. And from the view from Israel, I think it's also important to know that Israelis and Israeli officials are concerned about this trend, and yet there is a disconnect. There was a recent poll here that showed that around 80% of Jewish Israelis believe that after the Iran war ends, that relations between Israel and the U.S. and public opinion will improve. And I don't think that you're seeing that bear out. Even the Gaza war, right, is not on everyone's screens every day, and yet this Pew poll from late March showed what it showed. I spoke to the foreign policy advisor of Netanyahu and asked him, what does Israel plan to do about this? And essentially the talking point is it's concerning, but we're paying a price for what Israel feels is necessary. And I think we should look into the future, into the end of this year when Israel holds elections. The big question is, will Netanyahu be re-elected? And if not, will there be what will the new government's policy be? I don't think it will be taking up a new policy toward Palestinians. But if it does anything differently, whether it's emphasizing regional alliances, whether it's acknowledging some compassion for human suffering, instead of being the neighborhood bully, that might be one slight change that we'll see what that brings.
Thank you. Heidi, do you have any closing thoughts on that, on this theme? It's a very open-ended theme, but
It is. I mean, I think Yeah, I mean, what you were asking before about the kind of long-term consequences and stability, I think Syria is really experimenting that with that right now, right? It was a driver of instability in the region for a very long time. Um, I think there is a lot of momentum both internally and also externally to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Um, but yeah, we should also keep in mind that Syria is potentially a new front for these expanding campaigns by Israel. They've made it very clear that they're trying to establish this presence in Kenitra. We had the bombings of downtown Damascus last summer, which there's really nothing to stop that from happening again. The Israelis have a very antagonistic relationship to the new Syrian authorities, which being here and living here, it's sort of inexplicable in a way, right? The relationship that they have is that they have a government here that doesn't have the capacity, partly because it was bombed out in the immediate fall of the regime. The new government here lost most of its military capacity. But you've got a government here that isn't really interested in antagonizing Israel, and Israel is very interested in antagonizing the new Syrian authorities. And so, yeah, it remains to be seen what actually happens here. But the occupation of land in Kenitra is a serious domestic problem and could become a driver of instability, right? There's a large part of the Syrian population that is incredibly angry about that. They want to see their government do something about that. But at this point, the government doesn't have the sort of the capacity to. But that can become a domestic issue very, very quickly and could become another driver of instability or to open up a new front. And we see them constantly almost making attempts to sort of appease the Israelis by not pushing back against that, by stopping smuggling operations across the Lebanese-Syrian border. I mean, I got an alert on my phone in the last half an hour saying that they've arrested dozens of what they call like Hezbollah cells inside Syria, which they say were coming here seeking to destabilize. But they're trying to show at every opportunity like we are not a problem, but it's not necessarily leading to anything that would create further stability here inside Syria or to stop that from becoming another front.
Okay, thank you all. This is an enlightening conversation. Thank you to the Overseas Press Club for hosting us. And hopefully, I don't know, I'm trying to think if there's some hopeful note we can end on. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but thank you all for joining today.
Well, thank you for having
Thanks.
us. Most appreciated. Thank you.